Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So to celebrate the release of Spider-Man No Way Home, I thought it'd be a fun idea to go through and rank all of the Spider-Man films that we have gotten so far. Now, I've actually already filmed this video before. I filmed it alongside my review for Spider-Man No Way Home, which you can check out on my channel now, but I wasn't quite happy with it. As I was filming it, I felt like my words were all over the place and my opinions weren't clear enough. And also initially I was going to try and determine, who the best Spider-Man was using various categories, which will pop up in this video. But I feel like it just made it so much harder for me to determine who the best Spider-Man was, even in my own opinion, that instead we're just going to go ahead and rank the Spider-Man films that we have gotten so far. And we're still going to keep in mind the categories that I imagined in my head as we go through my explanations of each of these films' positions on my list. But before we dive into this, just a small disclaimer, this is going to have spoilers for Spider-Man No Way Home. If you haven't yet seen the film and you don't want to be spoiled whatsoever, then I would highly recommend you come back after watching the film to check out this video. And so with that out of the way, all that remains to say is that, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and rank all of the Spider-Man movies. So when it comes to Spider-Man is basically the only Marvel property that has gotten various iterations throughout the course of the last 20 years. In the case of other Marvel properties, we're actually on their first instances. For example, the first Iron Man, the first Captain America, the first Thor. And in the case of the X-Men, for instance, which also started around about the same time as Spider-Man, we basically got one canon. There were various versions of each character in the X-Men, but it's basically all in the same universe, and that lasted for about 20 years. So Spider-Man is really unique in that we have gotten various iterations of the character on the big screen, and that's not something that we can say for a lot of the Marvel properties that we have gotten so far, because they've only just become popular in the last 10 years and we're existing in that same canon still. So starting off at the very bottom of our list, at number 9 we have Amazing Spider-Man 2. This will come at no surprise to anyone. Amazing Spider-Man 2 isn't exactly beloved amongst fans, and it certainly has its critics, and it's for various reasons. But I would say the main issue when it comes to this film is that there are just way too many storylines going on at once. They tried to set up way too much in one film and they flopped. Like, they completely fumbled the bag when it came to all of these storylines that they tried to balance in the film and all of these villains that they tried to introduce. Because first off, we have the character of Harry Osborn being introduced into the Mark Webb verse of Spider-Man, and this version of Harry has this ailing father who ends up dying at the very beginning of the film because of this family curse that they have, the Osborn curse, that gives them this mysterious illness. And so he himself, even though he's much younger, is starting to experience the symptoms of said illness, and so throughout the film he is driven by trying to find a cure, and he has it in his mind that the only cure available to him is Spidey's blood. So the story becomes about Harry trying to hunt down Spider-Man so he could use his blood to develop a cure for the Osborn curse, and that becomes the main motivation of the character to turn evil, alongside the fact that he's physically starting to change because of this disease overtaking him very quickly, I might add, throughout the course of this film, even though the development of the disease was quite gradual up until now. But whatever. I guess maybe the stress of inheriting a fortune and a whole company may have expedited things, but sure, like, all of a sudden he's scaly, he's looking horrific. Any fans just really disliked the look that Harry Osborn had as the new Green Goblin. It was a choice, okay, but it was one that people did not look favorably on. But to me, the biggest issue when it comes to the Harry Osborn storyline is, know, however you want to justify his motives, fine, whatever. He's trying to escape death, like that makes sense. But to me, it's the fact that the friendship between Harry and Peter was never really set up particularly well. In the film itself, Peter only re-enters Harry's life after hearing about the death of his father. And sure, it's completely understandable that he would relate to Harry in that way, having lost his own parents. And, you know, there is a storyline exploring Peter's parents in the film, so it kind of makes sense. But this kind of sudden reunion that happens between the two doesn't have the same emotional impact as the friendship that existed in, say, the Sam Raimi verse, where that friendship was established a bit earlier on. And so there was some, you know, really stable ground, a good foundation for the two, so that when the betrayal happened, it actually meant something, which can't be said for Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, that in itself was already such a feat, and it was so busy and such a difficult storyline to try and pursue, especially when they're rushing into things and trying to establish this friendship really, really quickly before the betrayal happens in one film. But then we also have the added element of Electro, the dubstep master. Listen, I recently rewatched these Spider-Man films in preparation for this video, and I have to say, even though I'd heard jokes from like Screen Junkies and He about the dubstep in Amazing Spider-Man 2 that introduces Electro as a character, I always like brushed it off because I was like, oh, it's a parody, obviously they're gonna exaggerate it. But when I watched this film, when I tell you that they were dropping those beats, it was pure dubstep. Like, it took me all the way back to the 2010s. It was crazy. But yeah, Electro is a whole different beast in himself, okay? Because he is supposed to be this like nerdy character. I can't believe they did this to Jamie Foxx. He is supposed to be like, this guy signed Gold Digger. Like, have some respect. Anyway, so he's supposed to be this like super nerdy character. He has a comb over and he has, you know, these glasses. He's just a super nerd. He's supposed to exemplify like a super nerdy, I guess, comic book fan. Like, I don't know. Maybe that's why fans didn't like him. But yeah, he's a huge Spider-Man fan, which is funny because, you know, in Spider-Man No Way Home, they kind of retcon that and they're like, oh, he thought that Spider-Man was black, which is a hilarious joke in the film. But he is a huge Spider-Man fan in this film, and then he finally gets to meet Spider-Man, and it's a classic case of never meet your heroes, because the first time around goes well and Spider-Man acknowledges him, but the second time around, you know, he has already turned into Electro after falling into a vat of eels. Okay, Spider-Man logic. So he's in Times Square already lighting things up, but Spider-Man is trying to talk him down. But then, of course, the police, being trigger happy, decide to shoot at him, and that's when things go haywire. So many cool puns in here. I think in this instance, whilst, you know, Electro as a character is an interesting concept, he's a cool villain in theory, I think the motives here are much weaker than that of Harry Osborn, because at least he was fighting for something meaningful, whereas Electro was fighting for what? Like, to be seen. But it was very vague, it wasn't done very well, and on top of that, the fact that they have to kind of balance this storyline as well as the Harry Osborn storyline did a disservice to both characters. But that still isn't it. That still isn't even it, because at the very end there, they're also trying to establish the Sinister Six. And so you have this scene where they're walking down one of the Oscorp labs, like underground, where you have, you know, the costumes for the Vulture and also the arms for Doc Ock, like all of these Easter eggs suggesting that perhaps in the future they can build a Sinister Six. They start off with the Rhino, who is like the least impressive character, and also that was revealed in the actual trailer for the film, which was no help. At the end of the day, no matter what they tried to set up, the film itself did not have a good enough foundation to build anything upon, and so that just kind of fell flat, and it actually led to the end of the franchise. So I would say comfortably I would say comfortably that Amazing Spider-Man 2 would be dead last on my list. Okay, so next up at number 8 we have Spider-Man 3. So now we're getting back in time to the Sam Raimi verse, and here we have the third and last of the Sam Raimi trilogy that unfortunately underperformed due to a lot of the issues that were actually echoed years afterwards in Amazing Spider-Man 2. Here again we have this overpopulation of villains that are all done a disservice due to lack of screen time, due to lack of focus on each of them. We also have have a very bizarre character turn for Peter Parker himself. You know, I would say at least with Amazing Spider-Man 2, even though the villains are pretty atrocious, at least Peter goes through a kind of reasonable character arc and he goes through a huge loss at the very least as well. You know, I wouldn't say that Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a terrible, awful film, because there are moments with emotional weight, particularly the death of Gwen Stacy, that do kind of stay with you, and especially when you see that arc come back around with a Spider-Man No Way Home. But in the case of Spider-Man 3, it's just so all over the place with these villains, and again, each of them are interesting ideas in theory, but the execution is awful. The only thing that I would say kind of gives Spider-Man 3 a leg up is, first of all, I would say that the character of Peter Parker is set up much better than Peter Parker in the Mark Webb-verse, because Sam Raimi does do a lot of the legwork in the first 2 films to really set up this character in a beautiful, well-rounded way. So Spider-Man 3, even though on its own it's kind of a mess, it kind of does the character disservice, but still, like, it couldn't erase all of the goodwill that was built from the first 2 films when it comes to the character development of Peter and his relationship with MJ, for instance. Whereas in the case of Amazing Spider-Man 2, there was a lot of repetition, with Peter just learning the same lesson that he did in the first Amazing Spider-Man, with the death of Gwen Stacy's father, except this time around it was Gwen Stacy herself who died. So like, it was a bit repetitive. It felt like he was kind of going in circles, and then also he went down the rabbit hole of, you know, his parents and this conspiracy and whatnot. It was a bit of a mess. They're both a bit of a mess, okay? Honestly, like, I could switch them around when I think of certain scenes that make me cringe in Spider-Man 3, like Peter being horribly abusive and like humiliating Mary Jane in front of everyone in the restaurant when she's working as a waitress. Like, that was a horrible scene. So yeah, I could honestly swap these over. Either way, these aren't great. Okay, so next one on my list, at number 7, we have Amazing Spider-Man. Now, this first reboot that was directed by Mark Webb gave us a whole new Peter Parker in the form of Andrew Garfield's version of the character, and this version of the character was kind of criticized because, you know, whilst Andrew Garfield portrayed a great Spider-Man, he didn't quite hit the nail on the head when it came to his Peter Parker. And like, I have to agree, after rewatching the film recently as well, like, it was just so glaringly obvious how he was just too cool to be Peter Parker. Like, I'm sorry, I feel like Tobey Maguire was just too nerdy. Like, he was too much of a pathetic nerd for me personally. But in the case of Andrew Garfield, they swayed in the opposite direction a little too hard. He was just too charismatic and too likable and too attractive to be a convincing Peter Parker. And like I said, the Spider-Man angle was great. We'll talk about that in a second, but the Peter Parker of it all just wasn't quite there. I also feel like one thing that this film suffered from was kind of existing in the shadow of the Sam Raimi trilogy, because even though there were glaring issues with the trilogy, especially at the end where you had all of these villains that were kind of thrown in and it was just so busy and so messy and not really well done, in the case of the Amazing Spider-Man, they had the opportunity to kind of reboot, you know, refresh the franchise, but it felt like they were trying so hard not to kind of do the same thing as the Sam Raimi trilogy. They were really trying to dodge the previous films, and it just felt like it. Like, it felt like it was trying so hard to be different, from the color palette to the portrayal of Peter Parker. And this was all perfectly exemplified by the long-winded speech that was given by Uncle Ben prior to his death, where he tries to almost aggressively avoid the "with great power comes great responsibility" speech by going on about, if you have the ability to do something, then you must have a sense of responsibility. It was just so like long-winded, and it was so obvious that they didn't want to repeat what the Sam Raimi trilogy did. But in the end, like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That was perfectly shown in Spider-Man No Way Home, where they just embraced that speech and it actually had a lot more meaning to it in that film. Now, even though clearly Andrew Garfield's run as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man doesn't quite make it in the top half of my list, I still think there are some great elements to the Amazing Spider-Man duo. I was going to say trilogy, but it's not a trilogy. The two films that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, I do think, like I said, that Andrew Garfield was a great Spider-Man. He was very quippy, he was very charismatic, and you know, I grew up watching the Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon, the TV show on Disney XD, where he was voiced by Drake Bell. That's unfortunate, but I really loved that version of Spider-Man, and I feel like the quippiness and the kind of character that he has in that show is reflected really well in these films, and I think Andrew Garfield did a great job in, you know, giving us that on the big screen. And another thing that I would say is interesting about the character, it's not necessarily great, but it's interesting. This character is like low-key a psycho. Listen, especially after Uncle Ben died, when he was out on this vendetta trying to find that one guy with a star tattoo, and he was going around like around beating people up, like he was like enjoying it as well, which is crazy. He was kind of like, you know, off hinge a little bit, which I think is interesting. Like I said, it's not necessarily a good thing, but it's interesting, it's different for a Spider-Man, and I like that they actually shout out that anger that he had in No Way Home, because he himself mentions that he stopped pulling his punches at one point, and I think that's a really interesting dark angle for the character, and it's something that we actually see pay off in No Way Home. So seeing the actual consequences and the influence of all of this tragedy that Peter Parker is traditionally surrounded by was really interesting. Now, in the case of the villain of this film, the Lizard, it's kind of ridiculous. I would say that one thing that really did stick when it came to this franchise was Gwen Stacy. I think it's great that they switched things up after 3 films of hearing Mary Jane screaming and decided to introduce us to Gwen Stacy as a love interest instead. And she is markedly more involved and, you know, clever and, you know, really intuitive in this franchise in comparison to the largely passive role that Kirsten Dunst played as Mary Jane. Because even though Mary Jane does have a huge focus in Peter's life, she isn't really active or proactive in her own life, like in her role in those films. Whereas in the case of Gwen Stacy, they make a point to like give her a career at Oscorp and, you know, have her come up with ideas when she's helping Peter. And I think that just marks the changes in female representation from the, you know, early 2000s to the early 2010s that we saw with Amazing Spider-Man. Okay, so next up at number 7, this may surprise many of you. This may upset many of you, and like, I apologize in advance, I guess. But next one up is Spider-Man 1. Yes, the very first of Sam Raimi's films. This is the point where I mention, just a cheeky little mention here, that I didn't grow up a Spider-Man fan. Listen, growing up, my mum always told me that Spider-Man was for boys, so I never watched Spider-Man growing up, and the first Spider-Man that I actually saw in year 6 when I was 11 was Spider-Man 3, and we watched it at the very end to celebrate the end of primary school, aka elementary school for you Americans. So that was my experience with Spider-Man. It wasn't a very personal experience. I don't have that nostalgia attached to Sam Raimi's trilogy. So the first one I basically watched for the first time a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this video, and whilst I was shocked and surprised to see there were so many elements that I actually really enjoyed, I was also shocked and surprised by how much I disliked Peter Parker. I dislike Peter Parker. First of all, Tobey Maguire. Okay, this was 20 years ago, so he looked younger than he does in like No Way Home. Spoiler alert, he's in No Way Home. But still, he looked too old. He didn't look like a high schooler. This has always been my pet peeve, especially nowadays when, you know, shows tend to make an effort to try and make their stars look younger, look age appropriate. But back in the day, it's just so glaringly obvious now that these teenagers are being played by adults, and like there are so many videos nowadays on YouTube kind of explaining why that is problematic just on a deeper level. But on a superficial level, he just doesn't look like a teenager. It's really annoying. All of his friends as well, like all of his cohorts, look so old, and to me, like, one small switch would have made all the difference. Having him already be in college, like literally just have him be in college, have a story where, you know, Peter Parker is already in college and he does the exact same things. In fact, in part of the series he is in college college, so I don't understand why he couldn't start there already, and have him do the exact same things and be Spider-Man, but balance a college life instead of a high school life, because he doesn't look like a high school. I understand why they won't employ like an actual 15-16-year-old for employment law reasons and whatnot, but like just set it in college. Like that's literally the simplest fix, but whatever, it has to be high school because that's what the comics say, even though he doesn't look like a high schooler, and neither does Mary Jane, and certainly neither does Harry Osborn. It frustrated me. But secondly, when it comes to Peter Parker, he's just so pathetic. People have always said that like Andrew Garfield was a great Spider-Man. He was cool, he had the comebacks, he had the quips, whereas Tobey Maguire was a better Peter Parker because he was kind of a nerd, he was really sincere and earnest, he had that Peter Parker vibe to him. And whilst I completely agree that that divide definitely exists, I would say that, you know, in the case of Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, he leaves a little too pathetic sometimes, especially when it comes to Mary Jane, like him moaning about his relationship with Mary Jane. I bet you if you remove all of the scenes where he's moaning about his relationship with Mary Jane, you would literally have like half of the films left. And then on the flip side as well, like if you had a Mary Jane that was actually interesting, if you had a Mary Jane who was a cool character, she's independent, and you know, she's an interesting character to follow, and you understand why Peter is just so infatuated with her, then maybe it would be more bearable. But she is consistently only used as a damsel in distress. Consistently. There are times where she's, for example, doing well in her career. This isn't even in just like the first Spider-Man film, but let's just get into it, shall we? There are times when she's doing well in her career and you're like, good for you, Mary Jane. Or that time when she was gonna marry Elijah from the originals and from Vampire Diaries. I was like, oh my god, that's Elijah. Yeah, I was like, good for you, Mary Jane. But then she always ends up in this like life-threatening situation with one of Peter's villains, and it's like, oh, here we go. Or she's always screaming, either because she's been taken by the villains or because she's like being swung across the streets by Peter himself as Spider-Man. Her screams started to trigger me. I will say though, one thing that the Sam Raimi films did particularly well, and one thing that was set up very well in the first one, was Peter's life, you know, behind the scenes, his home life, his family life, and of course the death of Uncle Ben. I was really touched by how they handled that whole scenario. I feel like it's because it's been parodied so often and there are so many memes about it that by the time that I actually watched it, I had these expectations that it wouldn't really affect me, that I wouldn't really find it to be emotionally impactful. But when the scene actually comes, it is so meaningful, especially when you see the scene preceding it where Peter has this vendetta against the guy that runs this underground fight club. And so he refuses to help that guy when he's robbed, but then that same robber or thief ends up killing Uncle Ben. That to me is just so, it was just so gut-wrenching really to see that, like, oh, if he had just stepped in and done something. I mean, ultimately it's not his responsibility, it's that criminal's responsibility. Okay, like let's point the finger where it's due, but still, like, I think that was a really great storyline that did actually have some emotional impact for me. And it's a shame that they tried to like retcon that in Spider-Man 3. Another reason to dislike Spider-Man 3, where they were like, oh, it was Sandman who actually killed, like, okay, whatever. we're discounting that. Okay, that's not canon. But I do think that the first film sets that up wonderfully. It also sets up the impact of Uncle Ben's death really well, because, you know, unlike other franchises and movies where if a character loses a loved one, it's like really sad and painful for like that moment, but then there's a montage of them getting over it and then it's never mentioned again. In the case of the Sam Raimi films, you still feel the impact of the loss of Uncle Ben on Peter's life and on Aunt May's life, and that's something that feels really realistic and again endears the audience to Peter further. So when it comes to him experiencing that loss, like, I never begrudge the character in that sense. I just think it's annoying when he's like gushing over MJ and being pathetic. But I will say though, one thing that the original Spider-Man definitely does so much better than the films that I mentioned previously is the villain. Of course, here we have the iconic, okay, Willem Dafoe portraying Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. Now, I will say, I will say, watching the film, I was shocked to see how thin his motives were. They're really bad. It's like, you know, he's voted out of the company and so he turns into the Green Goblin. It's like, it's not great, okay? And he's also kind of a douchebag throughout. He's a douchebag towards Mary Jane, and he calls her like a gold digger, insinuating that she only wants to hang around Harry for his money. I don't know if that's in the first film or in like one of the succeeding films, but yeah, he's kind of a dickhead throughout. But still, I was pretty surprised to see how thin his motives were, but it doesn't matter because he's such an iconic villain. I did find it incredibly vindicating where in Spider-Man No Way Home they decided to rid him of the mask that people said was pointless because already Willem Dafoe was such great casting, both in terms of his performance but also his physical appearance as the Green Goblin, that wearing this Power Rangers mask only obscured that. And I also wanted to quickly mention, since this is the OG Sam Raimi film, the first one to come out, that the score, the Danny Elfman score, is fabulous. It's phenomenal. Listen, I don't dislike this film, okay? Like, it's number 7 on my list, not because I think it's bad. I think all the films from here on out are actually good. They're actually decent. It's just I had to rank them somehow. And I don't have that nostalgic tie to this film, which is why I'm seeing it in a bit more of a objective way. But the Danny Elfman score, excellent. And I was so proud of myself for noticing it was something Danny Elfman-like, even without knowing for sure, until I Googled it after the film. I was like, okay. Okay, so next up at number 6, we have Spider-Man Homecoming. So Spider-Man Homecoming marks the 3rd attempt by Sony to reboot the Spider-Man franchise, you know, notably because it is the most successful franchise that Sony has on its docket. So it was always going to try again and again and again until it worked. Okay, because they can't afford to let this franchise drop. It's literally its like prize jewel in its IP collection. But yes, in 2017 we got the first film in the 3rd iteration of Spider-Man, but this time around this Spider-Man portrayed by Tom Holland actually wasn't introduced in his solo film from 2017, but rather the year prior in a Captain America film, Captain America Civil War, aka Avengers 2.5, where he made a massive splash with that iconic moment where he comes into the fight in the Berlin airport holding Captain America's shield. The crowd goes wild, or at least we would have if it had it not been in the trailer. But anyways, that was a pretty iconic and momentous moment, but we did get to see a follow-up of his story in Homecoming, which is a great film. So first of all, one of the things that I really love about Homecoming is John Watts' inspiration from the John Hughes films of the 1980s that feel very youthful. Like, I feel like he was able to bring those films into the 21st century very successfully, and that alongside the cast itself, which actually looks of age, like I was saying, like they actually look like teenagers, to me just feels so much more youthful and so much more authentic to the character of Peter Parker, who's supposed to be at this stage in high school. And another thing that Homecoming does really well, and something that I really noticed upon rewatch, is that it tries to balance the kind of grandiose nature of the rest of the MCU, the huge Avengers level threats that they're constantly facing, with the daily challenges of a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Like here, as I said, this is taking place after the events of Captain America Civil War, where Peter was called in to help assist, you know, fighting against the rest of the Avengers over the whole Sokovia Accord situation. But then he has to come back into like reality, into his reality, and he's always on edge trying to figure out what the next mission is going to be. And he's been allowed, you know, to correspond with Happy and even to Tony Stark, who's like the epitome of an absentee father. So Peter is expecting great things. He's expecting to have Avengers level responsibilities, but now he's kind of been saddled with, you know, the daily life of a regular teenager who has this massive secret, and he doesn't really know how to find the balance between that. And that results in him being tempted to take advantage of his powers and like just show it off to his friends, just to say that he knows Spider-Man, for example, at that party at Liz's house. You know, it's just just like the very relatable teenager struggles for a character who's kind of balancing between being relatable, being a normal teenager versus also being an Avenger, which I think is a really unique angle, especially within the MCU. And then of course we have the fact that this film introduced us to Tom Holland's iteration of the character, and I love him. Listen, whilst people have often said that Tobey Maguire was the perfect Peter Parker, disagree, and people have said that Andrew Garfield was an excellent Spider-Man, 100% agree with that. I think that Tom Holland is a perfect amalgamation of both. He is a really fun Peter Parker who has that innocence there. He also has a perfect New Yorker accent, especially for his generation, and that is confirmed by a bunch of linguists on YouTube. So I felt validated where I was like, hang on, they also agree. But anyway, his accent is perfect considering he is the second British Spider-Man. And I also love that this iteration of the character actually has a friend that's like not out to get him. Ned is a difficult character, I'm not gonna lie. Because Ned is just a teenager, whereas Peter is like, you know, skirting on being a teenager and being an Avenger. So sometimes Ned does or thinks dumb teenager things, like he thinks Peter can just show up at a party wearing the Spider-Man costume, not realizing the consequences of that. And sometimes that can be frustrating to watch because you're like, Ned, you don't get it. But that's the point. Like, he's trying to support Peter nonetheless, but he's thinking small. He's thinking about Peter's reputation in high school rather than the fact that Peter was fighting against Avengers a few months ago. So Ned is a different kind of character, but he's not like a threat like Harry Osborn. You know, for once, Peter just has this reliable friend that he likes and like he likes hanging out with, and they have nerdy Star Wars stuff going on, and they have this cool handshake, and I really appreciate that about this version of the character. And then of course you have the third element to this classic Spider-Man trio in the form of MJ, who's this world's version of Mary Jane or Gwen Stacy, as we've seen previously. And MJ is a different kind of love interest because she kind of builds as a love interest. You know, Peter isn't automatically infatuated by her in the first film. You see that relationship kind of develop as time goes on, as she opens up to a friendship with the gang, which I think is authentic. But the flip side of that is that we don't actually know much about MJ. I feel like out of the three love interests that we have lined up so far, we know the least about her. And even though she makes a very heavy appearance in Spider-Man No Way Home, there isn't a lot of her backstory that is explored. And I would say that's something that the Sam Raimi verse does pretty well when it comes to the character of MJ, because even though she is a damsel in distress, both physically in terms of like always being captured by Spider-Man's villains, and that's basically the only reason why he cares about what the villains are up to begin with, let's be real, but also in terms of her home life, where she's this like pitiful victimized white woman who's like always in danger in terms of, you know, her father or her stepfather treating her poorly. And so Peter kind of has this protectiveness over her because he knows of her unfortunate home life. So she is a very tragic character in that way, but at least we know something about her, whereas in the case of MJ we know very little. But honestly, the main reason why this film is a cut above the others, first of all because I do like Tom Holland's Peter Parker so much, but also because Michael Keaton did not come to play. Michael Keaton did not come to play as the Vulture. Listen, first of all, I love the fact that the Vulture is yet another villain that was created by Tony Stark in the MCU. I've been telling you that Tony Stark is the biggest villain in the MCU. No one listens to me. Fine, it's fine. But the Vulture was also inadvertently created by Tony Stark because he had his own company going. Like Adrian Toomes, he had this thing going where they would pick up the scraps from the 2012 attempted invasion by the Chitauri under Loki, or ultimately under Thanos. And so they were just picking up these scraps and disposing of them appropriately until Tony Stark decided to come up with this whole, you know, agency, the Bureau of Damage Control or something, and they kind of took over, leaving a lot of Adrian's men out of a job. And so they decided to do things, you know, the underhanded way. They went down the criminal route and utilized some of the weapons that were left behind by the Chitauri to create, you know, new technology and weapons for themselves to run the streets. I feel like that's a great backstory. First of all, it makes perfect sense, especially in the context of the MCU. It slid right in there. It was beautifully done, and also it carries on the theme of Tony Stark creating the biggest villains in the MCU, but also the way that Michael Keaton played this role was unexpectedly excellent, like superb. He didn't phone it in, and of course it is marked by the scene. It is marked by the scene. There are two moments in this film where when I saw it in the cinema, I gasped audibly. First of all, it's the moment where Peter goes to Liz's house and the moment where you realize that Liz's dad is Adrian Toomes. I feel like that's one of the rare occasions where a plot twist actually surprised me. I was like, hold up, Liz is mixed race. Because you see her black mum and you're like, okay, but then Michael Keaton walks in. And then the moment in the car, that has to be one of the tensest car rides ever depicted on screen. The moment in the car when Adrian Toomes' mind, you can see the brain working, and he figures out, he's like, hang on a minute, he's Spider-Man. I think genius. Mwah. Genius. So next up at number 4, we have the sequel to Homecoming with Spider-Man Far From Home. So this kind of gets a leg up from Homecoming for me, just because of the long-term repercussions. I think they're pretty even, actually. I feel like I'd be hard pressed to say exactly what puts one over the other, and perhaps I'd even change my mind depending on the day, the hour, the direction of the winds. But I'd say as I'm sitting here now, I would put Far From Home just slightly above, because Quentin Beck was a mad one, okay? But let's discuss. I really did appreciate the fact that for once we got a Spider-Man film that took place elsewhere, perhaps because I live in Europe myself, okay? And part of this film is set in London, so I'm always happy to see. But yeah, I did like the fact that they went globe-trotting for this one. That just added a fun element and something that was really unique for the Spider-Man franchises that we've seen so far. I also feel like the story makes sense. It's actually a really strong story, because here we have once again this young hero who straddles the line between an ordinary teenager and an out-and-out Avenger who was fighting in space against Thanos and whatnot. So it makes sense that he would want to just leave all of that behind for a little bit, especially after experiencing the great loss of his mentor through Tony Stark. So he just wants to kind of let go of that a little bit and, you know, travel and worry about, you know, teenager things like what to get MJ during this trip. But then obviously, you know, trouble follows him and he's wrapped up in things again. I just think that's a really clever setup for the character. Again, establishing how he's unique and different from the rest of the Avengers in the MCU, because he is trying to have it both ways. That's something that the character struggles with throughout his trilogy, as we also see culminate in Spider-Man No Way Home. But here there's kind of beginnings of how it's not going to be possible for him to do so, and he was always going to struggle to be able to live out his life as Peter Parker and Spider-Man at the same time. But then we also have the villain, none other than Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, as played by Jake Gyllenhaal. I remember when this film came out that everyone kept saying that it was obvious that Mysterio was going to be a bad guy, because that's his whole thing in the comics. I wish everyone wouldn't say that. I wish everyone had not said that, because I didn't know. Like, I don't read the comics, as I often say on my channel, so I would have loved to walk in there all nice and surprised when the switch came. Of course, I would have always suspected that he would be the bad guy. He's called Mysterio and like he has a bad guy look. There was an edge to him throughout, but still I wish, you know, people would allow others to just experience it for the first time, because not everyone is aware of what happens in the comics. He's not a very well-known comic book character, but either way, I think Jake Gyllenhaal was excellent. I feel like he slotted himself right in to the Spider-Verse, and especially into Peter's life, being his new mentor. And once again, Quentin Beck follows in the long tradition of MCU villains that were created by Tony Stark. Now, as I said, I think No Way Home and Far From Home are pretty much on the same level, but the only thing that sets Far From Home apart is its long-lasting repercussions. Okay, so now we're down to the top 3 of the Spider-Verse movies, and at number 3 we have to give some love to a classic, a favorite amongst fans, that is Spider-Man 2. The second entry into the Sam Raimi universe. Now, first up, I would say that Spider-Man 2 excels where the first Spider-Man kind of lacked, in giving us a villain that actually had a believable and interesting backstory slash motive. Because here we have Alfred Molina portraying Doc Ock, who is this scientist who's developing this kind of energy source or something for the city that could revolutionize renewable energy. energy. That's how you know he's a good guy at the beginning. He's working towards renewable energy. But I think what's notable about Doc Ock is that he does start off as a good guy. Like, he's a good person at the beginning that is corrupted by his technology. Whereas Norman Osborn, like I said, always sucked. He was always a dickhead, low key. But in the case of Doc Ock, we actually see scenes with him and Peter having dinner, and you know, he's talking about how much he loves his wife and giving advice to Peter about his relationship with Mary Jane. Like, it's actually really touching, and it makes the kind of twist, the kind of betrayal, all the more painful for the audience, because we see the potential that relationship had and how he could have potentially been a mentor to Peter in the long term. And also, the second film does a lot more to explore the kind of personal themes in Peter's life that we have seen transcend across these various iterations of the character. Of course, trying to balance the life of, you know, Peter Parker with that of Spider-Man, his responsibilities on both ends and how he's struggling to do so, I feel like was carried out really, really well. Okay, so now we're at the top two, and next up on my list, this is really, really difficult, but I'm going to put the next one up at number 2 as Spider-Man No Way Home. I'm sorry. I think it has to be the case. Okay, I'll try and explain my reasoning. First of all, I'm not going to go through my thoughts on Spider-Man No Way Home in any depth, because I have a massive video on the film that you can check out, as I said before. But I will say that that is like an ultimate Spider-Man film, pun intended, okay? That is the ultimate Spider-Man film. First of all, you have the continuation of Far From Home. As I said before, we actually have the consequences of Quentin Beck's reveal actually being explored extensively in this film, to the point where you understand why he would turn to Doctor Strange to ask him for help and, you know, assistance in trying to better the lives of not himself, but the people around him, the people that he cares about, you know, in the case of safety, in the case of future prospects, and how this reveal has affected them, which I think is very selfless and very Peter Parker. But then also you have this kind of introduction of the multiverse, the idea that the spell goes wrong and that creates a break in the multiverse that allows for conveniently characters from previous franchises to show up. And yes, you know, there are definitely convoluted ways that they explain how all of this happens. You know, the storytelling isn't as airtight, which is why I kind of sway towards it being number 2 on my list, because there are a lot of like conveniences and plot holes, which I discuss in my review more extensively, that I feel like that the story isn't as tight as it needed to be a perfect Spider-Man film, and just a perfect film overall. Overall, I do think it successfully incorporates all of these characters from the previous Spider-Man franchises, giving them a second chance to be portrayed the way that the fans had wanted all this time, or perhaps giving them a second chance to be seen again in this incredibly successful franchise that has become the MCU. I will say another reason why I think this film kind of loses points a little bit is because it doesn't really rely on any original villains of its own, for instance. Like, it does heavily rely on what preceded it, so I can't give it all the credit in the world. But I will say there are instances where it does a better job with what came before. I think the perfect example of this is Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, because I think he's done even better in this film. No Way Home wasn't just a second chance for the villains of the previous franchises, because of course we got to see the re-entry of the previous Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. So this was it, like this was their one shot, and I have to say they absolutely knocked it out of the park. But because of the minor concessions that I mentioned earlier, I can't in good conscience name this the very best Spider-Man film ever. Which leads me to the one that is. And that is, of course, how could it ever be anything else? 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Listen. Listen, if any one of you, if that single person who has been around since day one and watched my best of 2018 video is watching this video now, you will not be surprised. This will come as no surprise to you. I love Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I adore that film. I've talked about it several times on this channel, in fact. I think it is a very rare but very true, perfect film from start to finish. So let me just gather my thoughts. It's been a while since I've talked about this film, so let me just refresh my memory. First of all, the animation. I've said this millions of times. The animation in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is like no other. You know, when I was reviewing animated films a couple of years back, I always talked about how they seem to have a sameness to them. The animation style seemed to have been standardized, whereas previously you could tell if a film was, you know, Disney, if it was Pixar, if it was DreamWorks, if it was Illumination. But for a while there, everything just seemed to come together in this like harmonious blob, and nothing really felt distinct anymore. But then along came Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, giving us incredible animation, playing around with frame rates, playing around all sorts, just this experimental style that absolutely worked. Then we have the introduction of Miles Morales. This was the first big screen introduction of the character. First of all, having him be an Afro-Latino Spider-Man does change some of the context of the character, and it also introduces us to a new family dynamic because his mother is a Latina and his father is African-American, I believe. So they have a different family dynamic there, on top of the fact that his parents are alive as opposed to Peter Parker, who is an orphan and he's raised by his aunt and uncle. But then you still have that connection to Miles's uncle, who is the Prowler, and here we have a different dynamic where, you know, in the case of Peter Parker, his uncle was a positive moral influence on him. You know, he taught him with great power comes great responsibility, and his death was like a key turning point in Peter's life because of that loss of the moral center and also a father figure. But in the case of, you know, Miles and his relationship with the Prowler is a negative influence on him and is someone that his father actually doesn't want him spending a lot of time with, because his father is actually on the opposite side of the law and because he's a police officer. So there's a really interesting dynamic there. But that's even before we introduce the Spider-Verse itself, because yes, before there was Spider-Man No Way Home, there was Into the Spider-Verse, which introduced mainstream audiences to the concept of a multiverse, and honestly they did it spectacularly well. If we're going to compare across the board all of the friendship groups, like, you know, in the Sam Raimi verse we had Harry Osborn, sucks as a friend, right at the bottom, and then we had Andrew Garfield, who has, I guess, Gwen Stacy as his only friend. You know, she's a good love interest though, so I'm not going to hold it against her, fine. But then we have, you know, Tom Holland's Spider-Man, who has Ned and he has MJ. He has a bit of a gang going on, so respect to him. But none of them compare. None of them compare to the friends that Miles made along his journey in the form of like Spider-Pig, Spider-Gwen, Spider-Man Noir. Are you kidding me? These characters were exceptional. And also the voice cast in this film is just amazing. I think Jake Johnson actually voiced one of the best iterations of Peter Parker in the entire landscape. Like, let's give it up for Peter B. Parker in this film, but also Nick Cage as Spider-Man Noir. Just stroke of genius. And then you have John Mulaney as Spider-Pig. It just, everything is exceptional. We even have a female Doc Ock who is voiced by Agatha Harkness herself. So like, I just think that the voice cast, the animation, the idea, the concept itself is carried out so well. And then of course we have another thing that No Way Home did not have, and that is the introduction of a new unique villain in the form of the Kingpin. And I do suspect that the Kingpin as a villain in this film was largely helped by the popularity of the character in the Netflix Daredevil series. Okay, hear me out. I do think that in the film he is written very well, okay, and the way that he's animated, this kind of menacing, you know, really huge presence, like physically on screen, I think is just excellent. But I do think that all of that was also helped by the popularity of Vincent D'Onofrio's iteration of the character in Daredevil. And so because he was already on like the mainstream consciousness, I think it was just enhanced by his appearance in this film. I could go on and on and on about Into the Spider-Verse. Like, trust me, I love this film. I love this film so much. I don't just think that it's the best Spider-Man movie. I think it's the best animated movie of the last decade, which I said so in my ranking of, you know, the films from the last decade video. But I will say one extra point before we leave off on this list is the soundtrack. The soundtrack. I can't talk about this film in good conscience without mentioning the soundtrack. Do you remember 2018? Do you remember how it was dominated by Sunflower? Please. I went back to listen to Sunflower recently just to be in the spirit of Miles Morales. I saw that the music video literally had like 2 billion views. Like it had 2 billion views. That song was the song of 2018. You can't tell me any differently. And when we recently heard it in like the trailer or the sneak peek for Across the Spider-Verse Part 1, I was like brought all the way back to, you know, back in the good old days. The way that song transported me back, it was a cultural reset. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my ranking of all of the Spider-Man movies, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this ranking down in the comments below. And how would you rank all of the Spider-Man movies? I'd love to see your list. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.